Hello, everyone. This is Colin Cox for Early American Literature, and today we are discussing Ralph Waldo Emerson, and in particular his essay Self Reliance. And the goal for this lecture is to certainly define this term that's often and appropriately associated with Emerson, transcendentalism, but also to just identify some of his main points, identify some moments from the text that support that claim, comment on those points, but then at the end, perhaps offer some challenges to some of Emerson's thoughts and maybe even some explanations for possible misreadings of Emerson. Because one of the questions I think I asked you in the discussions forum for this week is, which of Emerson's quotes do you like the most? And I think I framed it as Emerson is often regarded as an endlessly quotable writer, and I think you can see why. But I would argue being so quotable and being so verbose as he is, it might subject you to, or it might subject someone like him to misreadings, misinterpretations, perhaps taking particular lines out of context. But I'll get to all of that later, I'm sure. So let's start with just this phrase, transcendentalism, which became extremely popular in the mid 19th century, specifically the 1840s. And it's perhaps worth saying that in 1840, or in the 1840s, in the mid 19th century, America was still a very young place. And one of the things that I've perhaps suggested both explicitly but maybe even implicitly is how one of the challenges for you and even for me as the person who curates reading for an early American literature course is that because the country was so young, its literary history and literary heritage was equally young, which means that a lot of the choices I have, there might not be as much, perhaps, coherency. Some of it might feel a bit scattershot, and that in many ways helps to inform why Emerson was, and despite maybe a bit of waning in popularity from time to time, why Emerson remains so popular, because transcendentalism and a lot of the ideas that are present in many of his essays still define what it means, at least in our popular imagination, still defines what it means to be an American today. So, for example, the tenets or the characteristics of transcendentalism, radical individualism, and it's also worth saying when using a word like individualism or individualistic that you won't find that word anywhere in self-reliance. If you have a digital copy, just perform a Control F and type that language, and I don't think you'll find it. And it's principally because that word and that idea was imminent at the time. It was becoming in a lot of ways. And some scholars suggest that an English translation of Democracy in America, this book written by a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville, that upon translation of that text, this word individualistic became known and became quite popular. But at the time that Emerson wrote Self-Reliance, even though when he uses a word like self-reliance, what he's ultimately talking about is individualism, or prioritizing the individual over the communal, that word doesn't appear because perhaps he just didn't have that word or that phrase in his vocabulary. But because of this focus or this emphasis on self-reliance or the individual, this places him in many ways in direct contrast to someone we've read already this semester, John Winthrop. And perhaps if you just wanted to imagine a schematic, just think for someone like Winthrop, the community is first, and the desires of the individual are second. They're more second order, but it's completely flipped or inverted for someone like Emerson, who seems to think that the will and the desire of the individual matters more than the wills and desires of society and the community. And again, to support that claim, there's an endless number of quotes from Self-Reliance, but this emphasis on the individual and on individualism, this skepticism of institutions and history, and this anti-institutionalism is also present in Emerson, and we'll talk about some of that later as well. Plus, and this is something of a quick and dirty description, but his appreciation for and reverence for nature. And it's not just because, nature is pretty and whatnot. There are more substantial philosophical reasons for someone like Emerson regarding nature and when thinking about the importance of nature, but nature features quite prominently in Emerson's work. There's a whole other essay included in our book that's just about nature. It's called, I believe, Nature or On Nature. I'll double check one moment. And it is nature, and I almost wanted to imagine that it was on nature because you see those kinds of constructions in philosophical texts. And it's worth just saying, even though I don't like to indulge biographical information too much, Emerson is often called and often thought of as the first or the great American philosopher, even though he's not taught in philosophy classes. He's not given really any attention in philosophy departments, and we can perhaps talk about why. I might address that later. But what he does, the kind of philosophical work he does, it's perhaps not the kind of philosophical work you see now, or maybe even that one might see in the 20th century. If one were to go back and perhaps perform a survey of 20th century philosophy, you might find that someone like Emerson doesn't really have a place there. But all of that is to say that he is often thought of and considered as this American philosopher, this deeply philosophical figure. But I think where I want to start is just with this idea of individualism, even though, again, as I said a moment ago, that's not a word or a phrase you'll find in Self-Reliance. That is perhaps the word or phrase that I'll use. And basically how I want to do this, I want to just quote a couple of passages and then talk about them. So when I do that, I'll cite page numbers and you can follow along with me. And I think the place I want to start is actually on 238. And this is early in the essay. And again, Emerson returns to this multiple times throughout Self-Reliance, but this is one of the first times that he crystallizes the idea. So this is what he writes. These are the voices which we hear in solitude, but they grow faint and inaudible as we enter into the world. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree for a better securing of his bread to each shareholder, to surrender the liberty and culture of the eater. The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. It loves not realities and creators, but names and customs. Whoso would be a man must be a non-conformist. So here, a couple of things. First, notice how he uses perhaps incredibly bombastic language. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. And when I read language like that, the question I ask is, well, to what degree is this simply bombastic rhetoric, and to what degree does language like this actually reflect the true or earnest feelings of the writer? And I'll leave it to you to decide, because perhaps you could argue just through sheer repetition of this idea, what perhaps we're ultimately seeing is the projection of a kind of conviction. Now, if we flip forward to 244, I'll read again, and here we have a clearer sense of the importance of intuition, because for someone like Emerson, and I'll talk about this as it relates to nature because it's relevant, but when thinking about why he prizes or values the individual, part of it is because he sees within each individual person this potential for good. He, in many ways, even though he might sound a bit like a curmudgeon at times, there is something in self-reliance that suggests that mankind is perhaps perfectible in some way. Self-reliance, and Emerson seems to assume a kind of benevolence in all people, in all mankind, and perhaps if there are any instances where people drift from that benevolence and that perfection, it's not because there's anything wrong with them as individuals, it's because society, history, institutions have perverted them in some way. And again, I'll come back to this when thinking about certain challenges to Emerson, but this is what he writes. The inquiry leads us to that source at once the essence of genius, the essence of virtue, and the essence of life, which we call spontaneity or instinct. We denote this primary wisdom as intuition, whilst all later teachings are tuitions. In that deep force, the last fact behind which analysis cannot go, all things find their common origin. For the sense of being, which in calm hours rises, we know not how, in the soul, is not diverse from things, from space, from light, from time, from man, but one with them, and proceedeth obviously from the same source whence their life and being also proceedeth. We first share the life by which things exist and afterwards see them as appearances in nature and forget that we have shared their cause. So here, thinking about instinct and spontaneity, this is extremely important to someone like Emerson, because ultimately what he suggests in this passage is that history, institutions, that was an interesting slip, but history and institutions, they have a way of perverting what is pure and perhaps even sacred within each and every individual, and that is our intuition, our instincts. And even think about, and this is perhaps earlier in the essay when he says, have you ever had that feeling that you had an idea, but maybe you didn't have the courage to say it, or maybe even if you were in a classroom, not like this, obviously, but you were in a classroom and you had this idea, maybe even a response to one of my questions, but you didn't say it, but then someone else said it. And there's this kind of frustration that arises at that moment. Well, for someone like Emerson, he would say, no, trust your instincts, trust your intuitions. You know, it's as if there's something that transcends you, that's part of you, that is pure and sacred, and it really knows. And again, you can see why someone like Emerson is so seductive, because then he would argue all of those moments when you don't say what you ultimately think and when you don't say what you ultimately feel, it's a betrayal of sorts of you as an individual, you as a person with, again, a particular set of instincts, and you should really just embrace those kinds of moments, even if that means, and he addresses the potential fear that, well, if you just say what you feel and mean from one day to the next, someone who's paying attention may accuse you of hypocrisy and contradiction. Well, for someone like Emerson, he would just say, that's fine, because that doesn't really matter, because the truth that I am is the truth that I speak in the moment. And he, again, seems deeply skeptical of considering maybe what someone said yesterday or the day before. And once again, there is something quite bombastic about this. It's worth asking how plausible is this as a potential philosophy, as a way of living your life. But we certainly see for someone like Emerson, the individual, the power that the individual possesses, the power that the individual has access to through intuition and spontaneity is extremely important. Now, on page 246, again, just clarifying the importance of self-reliance, this is what he writes. This is the ultimate fact which we so quickly reach on this as on every topic, the resolution of all into the ever-blessed one. Virtue is the governor, the creator, the reality. All things real are so by so much of virtue as they contain. Hardship, husbandry, hunting, whaling, war, eloquence, personal weight are somewhat and engage my respect as examples of the soul's presence and impure action. I see the same law working in the nature for conservation and growth. The poise of a plant, the bended tree recovering itself from the strong wind, the vital resources of every vegetable and animal are also demonstrations of the self-sufficing and therefore self-relying soul. All history from its height to its trivial passages is the various record of this power. And I think this is important as well, because I think you could read Emerson and perhaps come to this conclusion, maybe this incorrect conclusion, that he seems to prize the individual, and by doing so, maybe this is an either or, that the individual is all that matters, which renders the community irrelevant or insignificant. But I think this is a passage, and this also reveals why, or at least it gestures toward, and I'll talk about this later, why he has such reverence for nature. But I think it's clear when reading a passage like this that he does see that humanity is connected, that perhaps there's even symbiotic relationship, a sharing that occurs between people, and he sees this happening in nature, which again is why he seems to like and prioritize nature so much. But for him, we only, and again, this is in complete contrast to Winthrop, but for him, for Emerson, we only reach a kind of stability when we prioritize self-reliance or individualism first. And again, just to remind you, for someone like Winthrop, he would say, no, the individual is only recognized through his, her, or their commitment to a community by perhaps suppressing their individual needs, wants, desires, etc. But again, you see Emerson flipping it a bit. So I think this is an important passage because it does reveal that Emerson is not this solipsistic thinker, which is to say he's not the kind of person who thinks just care for yourself and that's all that matters in the world. There's more depth and there's more nuance to what he's suggesting here. And the final passage is on 251. And this is near the end of the essay, but this is what he writes. Insist on yourself, never imitate. Your own gift you can present every moment with the cumulative force of a whole life's cultivation. But of the adopted talent of another, you have only an extemporaneous half possession. So here, the language I would pay attention to is certainly this again, endlessly quotable, insist on yourself, never imitate. But notice what he means by that. It's not don't imitate because, you don't want to be a faker or whatever, but it's don't imitate and trust yourself, be yourself. Have fidelity to your intuitions and to the spontaneity or the sense of spontaneity that allows your intuitions to emerge. Because if you don't do that, it's as if you're this half person or this half self. You're actually taking something from yourself in those sorts of moments. It's as if in those moments when you trust yourself, when you don't conform to history, institutions, authority figures, he writes about those as well. When you don't do those things, it's as if you are projecting out into a world or into the world, the purest and most unfettered version of yourself. But if you don't do that, you're just deluding yourself in some ways. And you can also see perhaps why lifestyle, I would call them charlatans, but they would perhaps think of themselves as gurus. You can see why, even if they don't cite Emerson directly, they're funnily enough, or ironically enough, taking his ideas and diluting them a bit. But from here, why don't we transition to some specific or particular passages where he writes about his antagonism for traditions and institutions. And I'll speak about, or I'll cite specific institutions or even ideas that he finds a bit abhorrent. And the first is near the beginning on page 238, when he writes about some antagonism he has for religion. And again, this is on 238, and this is what he writes. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of our own mind. Absolve you to yourself, and you shall have the suffrage of the world. I remember an answer which, when quite young, I was prompted to make to a valued adviser who was wont to importune me with the dear old doctrines of the church. On my saying, what have I to do with the sacredness of traditions if I live wholly from within? My friend suggested, but these impulses may be from below, not from above. I replied, they do not seem to me to be such, but if I am the devil's child, I will live then from the devil. No law can be sacred to me but that of my own nature. So this is at the very beginning. And again, maybe one of the reasons why I mentioned earlier that Emerson's popularity, it has certainly fluctuated a bit in history. This might give you a sense why certain politicians and political figures, when they talk about the importance of the individual, they're perhaps referencing someone like Emerson, but they never quote him directly. And perhaps one of the reasons why is because, well, and you see this often, he's just not Christian enough for a lot of people. Now, he also excoriates the past on 241, and this is what he writes. But why should you keep your head over your shoulder? Why drag about this monstrous corpse of your memory, lest you contradict somewhat you have stated in this or that public place? Suppose you should contradict yourself. What then? It seems to be a rule of wisdom never to rely on your memory alone, scarcely even in acts of pure memory, but bring the past for judgment into the thousand-eyed present and live ever in a new day. Trust your emotion. In your metaphysics, you have denied personality to the deity. Yet, when the devout motions of the soul come, yield to them heart and life, though they should clothe God with shape and color. So some of this I've already talked about, but again, it's always nice to have language. The past for someone like Emerson, it's problematic because perhaps, again, it's a way of mediating the sublimity of the moment, or it's a way of diluting how you might feel and how you might think in the moment. And because of that, it perhaps perverts one's intuitions. And for someone like Emerson, that is something he simply cannot abide, even if, and I think this is important, even if that means someone might rightly accuse you of hypocrisy and contradiction. For someone like Emerson, he would say, well, that's fine, because if I'm thinking, if there's something bad, or if there's something I would not want to be, I would not want to be someone who doesn't act with fidelity to my intuition and fidelity to the moment. Therefore, I will just be a hypocritical, contradictory figure, because for him, being a hypocrite is not as bad as betraying how you feel in the moment, betraying your intuitions, betraying that which maybe transcends you in some ways, but you still have access to it. And connected to this is this fallacy, which is consistency. And this is one of the more quotable moments for a lot of people from Self-Reliance. It's on the same page, 241. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers, and divines with consistency a great soul has simply nothing to do. So here, again, this crystallizes this idea that if you're constantly thinking, I must be consistent with what I said yesterday or 2 or 3 years ago or whatever, then sure, maybe there's something to that. But for someone like Emerson, that something is simply the hobgoblin of little minds. It's what smaller order individuals consider when they think about what intelligence and wisdom is. For him, wisdom is just ignoring the past entirely and projecting out into the world how you feel in the moment. Again, spontaneity, intuition. And then finally, perhaps it's nice to have a bit of language where he writes about history, and this is on page 248, and this is what he writes. Our age yields no great and perfect persons. We want men and women who shall renovate life and our societal state, but we see that most natures are insolvent, cannot satisfy their own wants, have an ambition out of all proportion to their practical force, and so do lean and beg day and night continually. Our housekeeping is mendicant, our arts, our occupations, our marriages, our religion. We have not chosen, but society has chosen for us. We are parlor soldiers. The rugged battle of fate, where strength is born, we shun. So here, again, it's just nice to have language where Emerson crystallizes his antagonism for, well, the past, but also what society ultimately embodies and what it's a metaphor for. It's not all of us collectively deciding what's best, but it's really just a projection of the past, a projection of tradition. And for someone like Emerson, that is abhorrent, that is first order abhorrence, and it's something to be rejected. Now, let's spend a few minutes talking about nature. And again, I mentioned this earlier and I said I would come back to it, and that's what I want to do now. For someone like Emerson, nature is extremely important because it offers him perhaps a vision of what human intuition can be, should be, and perhaps a great place to start is just 244. And on 244, no, I'm sorry, I said 244. I meant 245. It's just the next page. It's fine. But this is what he writes. It's about the roses. These roses under my window make no reference to former roses or to better ones. They are for what they are. They exist with God today. There is no time to them. There is simply the rose. It is perfect in every moment of its existence. Before a leaf bud has burst, its whole life acts. In the full-blown flower, there is no more. In the leafless root, there is no less. Its nature is satisfied, and it satisfies nature in all moments alike. There is no time to it. But man postpones or remembers. He does not live in the present, but with reverted eye laments the past, or heedless of the riches that surround him, stands on tiptoe to foresee the future. He cannot be happy and strong until he too lives with nature in the present above time. So here, again, just using the rose as a metaphor or as an example, a simile, we have a clear sense of what Emerson ultimately values about nature and what he finds in nature. And I think this is important, using that kind of language. What he finds in nature, he finds something that, as it acts, it doesn't make reference to the past, it doesn't make reference to the future, it just does. If we think about some of the things I've talked about and some of the passages I've read regarding spontaneity, intuition, it's better to be a hypocrite than to just constantly defer to consistency. It's clear why nature, especially in this passage, is so important, because nature doesn't recognize the past or the future. Nature just recognizes the moment. You could imagine thinking that for someone like Emerson, nature self actualizes at every moment of its existence. And for him, that is so important. Moments and what in particular moments allow us to access this transcendent sense of intuition, or this transcendent intuition. But there's another passage as well on 246, and I've maybe read this already, but I think I'll read it again. I see the same law working in the nature for conservation and growth. The poise of a plant, the bended tree recovering itself from the strong wind, the vital resources of every vegetable and animal are also demonstrations of the self-sufficing and therefore self-relying soul. All history, from its highest to its trivial passages, is the various record of this power. So again, sure, for someone like Emerson, all of these different aspects or elements of nature, from the tree that bends to the plant that's poised to every vegetable and every animal, they are individual. He identifies them as these individual entities, but they are connected. And again, when thinking about, especially in contrast to someone like Winthrop, how do we arrive at something approximating stability? For someone like Emerson, it's not by prioritizing the community over the individual, but it's by prioritizing the individual over the community. That's how we arrive at that ideal place. And again, you can see how, especially for an American audience and a place that's attempting to understand itself in the world, especially as young and fresh and green as we were at the time, why these sorts of ideas would not only seem attractive, but also why well over 100 years later, 150 plus years later, we still retain a lot of these ideas. If any of you recall, early in the semester, I believe when we were reading Winthrop, I asked you, do you think about yourself principally as an individual or principally as a member of a community? And here is where that question, hopefully you start to see why I would ask a question like that. It's because with Winthrop, there's one option, which is suppress, and my goodness, even suppress is not a word I like, but if we're just thinking of orders, community is first, individual is second. But with Winthrop, he really flips it in a lot of ways. So I would perhaps just ask that same question again after reading after reading Emerson. Do you still think of yourself as an individual first? Do you hew closer to someone like Emerson, or are you persuaded by Winthrop? And I can't help, and we're all in a unique position to ask this question, especially considering COVID-19, but has the particulars of this moment perhaps shifted the way you're thinking about this question? Because it's interesting how particular moments have a way, these kinds of events have a way of fundamentally changing our orientation to these sorts of questions. But earlier I said I would end by saying something about, well, how can we challenge Emerson here? Are there ways of challenging these ideas? And I think one place to start, and again, maybe this is particularly relevant considering where we are as a society, as a species, as a world, but on 239, he seems to write in rather pejorative terms about charity. And this is what he says on 239. Are they my poor? I tell thee, though foolish philanthropist, that I grudge the dollar, the dime, the cent I give to such men as do not belong to me and to whom I do not belong. There is a class of persons to whom by all spiritual affinity I am bought and sold. For them I will go to prison if need be. But your miscellaneous popular charities, the education at college of fools, the building of meeting houses, to the vain end to which many now stand, alms to sots and the thousandfold relief societies. Though I confess with shame, I sometimes succumb and give the dollar. It is a wicked dollar, which by and by I shall have the manhood to withhold. So even here, if you just take that quote and end with the sentence, and to whom I do not belong, then you might think, my God, Winthrop is just an awful, despicable human being. How could someone who would write so negatively about charity ever gain any traction? But I think if you finish the paragraph, he contextualizes this a bit, because he seems to turn this into a conversation, again, about institutions. But with all of that said, there is still this perspective he offers about how they are not, quote, my poor. I tell thee, thou foolish philanthropist, that I grudge the dollar, the dime, the cent I give to such men as do not belong to me. And I guess the question worth asking, or the way to challenge Winthrop here, is to say, well, all of that sounds good, but is that possibly a fallacy? You're suggesting that perhaps we're not as connected as we ultimately are. And he, you could argue, indirectly addresses that later in the essay. But I think maybe that's one way of challenging Emerson. And I may have said Winthrop a moment ago, but I meant Emerson. Sorry, I have Winthrop in my imagination as I'm thinking about Emerson. But maybe that's one way you could challenge him, that even though there's a lot of subtlety to self-reliance, he perhaps, whether he intended to or not, really invites particular misreadings. And you could certainly imagine how someone could finish reading self-reliance, and I mentioned this before, how someone could finish reading self-reliance and come to the conclusion that they are beholden to no one but themselves. And that is certainly not what Emerson suggests. But on page 250, he writes a bit about travel, and someone could possibly conclude that he is something of an isolationist. And this is what he writes: traveling is a fool's paradise. We owe to our first journeys the discovery that place is nothing. At home I dream that at Naples, at Rome, I can be intoxicated with beauty and lose my sadness. I pack my trunk, embrace my friends, embark on the sea, and at last wake up in Naples, and there beside me is the stern fact, the sad self, unrelenting, identical, that I fled from. I seek the Vatican and the palaces. I affect to be intoxicated with sights and suggestions, but I am not intoxicated. My giant goes with me wherever I go. And again, what he's ultimately suggesting, he's not suggesting we should never travel. He's not an isolationist. But if you just read that one line, travel is a fool's paradise, you could see how someone could just read that and think what Emerson's ultimately suggesting is we should be perhaps isolationists. We shouldn't extend out into the world. But his larger point, if you finish the paragraph, is travel doesn't free you from yourself, whatever it is. Maybe when thinking about travel as a metaphor for just running or fleeing from the self, traveling isn't an antidote for that. If that's what you're attempting to do, this is impossible. But I would love to know what someone like Emerson would think after reading the book Eat, Pray, Love, because I think he would probably conclude this is just total nonsense. So again, Emerson is so easy to misread at times, and he's so easy to take out of context. But within context, perhaps there is some real wisdom there. But on the whole, there is this consistent suggestion, and I've addressed this already, that the power of the individual is paramount to all else. And on 247, he even says, I must be myself. But you could perhaps ask, well, just because something is true for you, that doesn't mean it's true for everyone else. And I would certainly encourage any of you who read Self-Reliance and found it persuasive, but still find this as a bit of a sticking place, to just ask yourself what you would say to that, how you would address it, how how do we address this larger question about individual wants, desires, and wills, especially as it relates to communities and societies or just the collective at large? Individuals can do deplorable things. And again, Emerson is one of those figures who I would want to bring into the 21st century, because I would want to ask him, well, just create a Twitter account for a couple of hours and then tell me if you think the individual is someone who, or tell me if you think the will of the individual really matters more than the collective. I'm curious to know what someone like Emerson would say to that, and I think what he would perhaps say, what he would respond to that kind of a question or that kind of proposition with is, well, those individuals are not acting in good faith. They're bad faith actors because they're not actually projecting that transcendent self. They're being influenced by ideologies, by history, by society, by peer groups, etc. And what we need to do is strip all of that. And again, I'm sympathetic to that reading, because it does seem to suggest that there's something potentially innately good about all of us, and the things that pervert us, maybe not all the time or maybe not even often, but in a lot of cases, are societies, histories, ideologies, peer groups, etc. But I'll leave it to you, because I'm at 40 minutes. I'll leave it to you to conclude what you think of those ideas. So, Self-Reliance, it's an essay that I really enjoy, and it's not an essay that I necessarily enjoy because I agree with everything, or maybe even anything Emerson says, but I think he is a bit provocative. And if you're someone who has heard often, or even believe, and I wouldn't begrudge you for believing this, that the individual matters, which again, this as an idea is so foundational, it seems, to the American ethos. I think Emerson offers interesting support for that idea, but perhaps even challenges to the way that idea is often communicated in its simplest forms, because I think a lot of you might agree that too often when people gesture towards the will and the power of the individual, it's not as complicated and it's not as nuanced as what Emerson has in mind, and maybe it should be. So, okay, I think I'll leave it there for now. I hope all of you have a great week, and I will talk to you in a couple of days.